Hello, my name is Borda from the Alan Turing Institute, and I'm very pleased to present today on serious games, embracing activism and AI. This talk, um, this talk is part of a chapter on immersive serious games, which is available in a newly published book, The Arts and Computational Culture, which is being launched at the EVA London conference. I would also like to acknowledge my wonderful co-author, Andrea Molnar, who is not able to present today. So, what are serious games? In brief, they're digital game technologies that serve a serious purpose other than simply entertainment. The word serious game came into the literature in 1970 to refer to video games and has since become pervasive as a medium for learning and education in healthcare and engineering, military, and other sectors such as arts and culture, which I'll be focusing on today. So, elements of serious games largely are underpinned by pedagogic aspects such as learning objectives um, and integration aspects such as game rules, gameplay, and technical aspects such as platforms supporting serious games. Um, for instance, an example of education focused serious game is Minecraft's education version, which has been made available to many schools supporting their curricula, such as in teaching mathematics. Simulation is another area of serious games where they reproduce or imitate real life situations and using characters and recreated scenarios. So players find themselves immersed in a world similar to the one that they have beyond their screen. So Democracy 3 is an example of a strategy game in which a player can assume the role of a leader of a country and then have to make difficult decisions about economy, employment, and education, and all those variables that have an impact on public opinion. So very timely in a period of elections around the world. So another type of feature of serious games is also problem solving, and I've just drawn an example called iWire, which is designed by scientists from MIT and has been around for a few years, and it invites players to map the brain deciphering information about human brain cells, particularly looking at reconstructing neurons and the connections between them. And hundreds of thousands of players have been working with iWire as a game, and also at the same time helping to researchers discover new and connections in this space. And this game has relevance also to AI games, which use machine learning and massive amounts of data um, to to draw from. And we'll be saying a little bit more about that. And then we have storytelling as a very fundamental component of engaging participants in conveying information and supporting journeys through character interactions through the environment and gameplay. And so storytelling elements are very key in the way that some serious games may be supported. So also in that regard, thinking about the levels of immersion of games and how they also enhance both the story and learning reinforcement, for instance. So non-immersive games using a controller and a desktop to much more immersive games that rely on, for instance, head-mounted displays and controllers for that can be used for tracking, for instance. So we'll have some examples in this talk related to uh, different types of immersion. So delving into serious games in art and culture, um, we have a number of games that appeared in the 2000s, but they're earlier games, and they often are around looking at historical reconstruction and scenarios related to history, and to bring about cultural awareness as well as a social history. And often these games are free choice learning, meaning they're not constructed with defined selected choices, but there are opportunities for the learner or the player to be self-guided and to be able to explore. And serious games in the arts and culture sector have been a broad spectrum of technologies, including internet and mobile apps and VR and AR, as well as AI enhanced. So thinking about a very early game, this is actually quite a precursor to even the name serious game. The Sumerian game was developed in 1964 by a high school teacher, Mabel Addis, and who could be also considered the first woman-female game designer, and with a collaboration with IBM. So this game was a text game, largely set with a slide, with a teleprinter and a slide show complementing the game context. And the player was set in a scene of 3,500 BC and could act as a ruler of the city of Lagash and Sumer over an increasingly period of complex economic simulations. So also an early simulated game, which is worth mentioning. And then moving forward to the Oregon Trail, also text-based and simple graphics, and a Oregon Trail set the player as an American settler in 1848 with a goal to travel by wagon train from Missouri to Oregon and facing various challenges en route based on historical facts. And the Oregon Trail is unique in the sense that it has survived decades of development and evolution with other games and is available on mobile apps, for instance, as a mobile app. So still a very popular game. Going forward, another collaboration with IBM is the game uh, Forbidden City, Beyond Space and Time. And Forbidden City is an educational VR game where the player interacts as an avatar and explores the Forbidden City in Beijing, as it was during the Qing Dynasty, 1644 to 1912. And you can see a number of screenshots as an avatar walks around the city and with the intention of interacting with various people around the palace, for instance, and learning along the way about different cultural traditions and practice. Micro Rangers is an example of a geolocative game available to audiences in the American Museum of Natural History, where collections were brought to life through an augmented reality game and with gameplay supported through a number of characters. In this image, we can see the bison diorama at the Natural History Museum, drawing out information, for instance, climate change and impact on bisons. And again, these games draw out information that wouldn't necessarily be so visible to an audience member in a with a just curatorial text. So really beginning to explore a wider context for museum collections and objects. And on that note, thinking about also gameplay and reflection and mobilization in the way in which players can become empathetic towards various scenarios, the environment, social change, for instance. So one example is Marina Abramovich's mobile game Rising, developed in 2018, in which the avatar of Abramovich interacts with players about the threat of global warming and rising oceans, for instance. And the player is left with a number of choices to make, which could have dire consequences, for instance, for the avatar of Abramovich. Indigenous Metaverse is an example of a game produced for First Nations peoples, particularly the Anishinaabe First Nations, and brings us closer to uh, more of the spiritual and environmental lens in which First Nations bring into this game. And here is the game as the introduction to the game. Following from the Indigenous Metaverse trailer, there's also other games that have been made popular in the serious game sector, also dealing with climate and the environment. And for instance, Terra Nil is an example of a game which, instead of building cities or human settlements, we're looking at the reverse, where it's very much about promoting rewilding and reconstruction of nature. So addressing the climate crisis and also seeking to restore nature rather than exploit it. So thinking about some of the technologies underpinning serious games, such as AI, we've had touch points with iWire, the game on mapping the brain, and also within the arts and culture sector, there's an opportunity being drawn out in terms of all of the data that museums hold on their collections. And Harvard Art Museums, for a number of years, have been looking at AI in terms of applying machine vision algorithms to its 53 plus million um, uh, tags and descriptions of collections and images. And it allows the players, through an annotation search, for instance, uh, players and learners, it's not strictly a game, but you could be self-directed to um, explore in a game-like way around the collections and learning about how one computers interpret paintings, photographs, and sculptures, but also discovering the ways in which we can look at patterns and the ways that collections um, and objects of all media can be thought through in terms of emotive terms, in terms of categorization, and in other exploratory ways. So, concurrent to explorations in AI and looking at collections through search, for instance, a number of the museums had been exploring chatbots before even ChatGPT, which was launched in 2023. The Louvre, for instance, had been exploring the ways a virtual assistant or a virtual guide could interact with visitors. And here's an example from the Louvre chatbot looking at the Mona Lisa. And you can see that it's quite friendly toward children, for instance, and providing an opportunity for children to ask questions and learn more about a work such as the Mona Lisa as they explore the museum. with COVID in 2020 and to 2022, for instance, many museums were closed and we're bringing much more of their collections online. And this included games such as the Getty's Animal Art Generator, which allowed a, uh, a visitor, a virtual visitor, to become a curator in their own home and to be able to select in images of famous artworks and create their own in-home gallery using the Animal Crossing art generator tool. Though robots have not quite entered the serious game area, it's worth mentioning them because as a technology, as a potential character or interaction uh, point for players in the future, they have been around in the arts and culture sector as museums and cultural organizations have explored their ability to interact with us as visitors, but also in more profound ways. So an early robot was in a museum was Berenson, who was considered one of the first robot art critics, as it used sensors to read facial expressions and made judgments on people's reactions to paintings based on those expressions. Ada was launched in 2019 as a humanoid robot and as an artist and a robot. And Ada has been on the world stage in many conferences and evolving as Ada learns more how to draw and exhibit, and has been a speaker, for instance, on BBC Women's Hour. So these are all developments which you may see in the future. Going back to a game in 2019 and even further back to 1964, which was an early computer game based on natural language processing and interaction between a patient and a therapist, we see these early attempts at role play becoming again very much embedded in gameplay, and a game sort of drawing from that early 1964 program. We see Eliza as a new character in Seattle, who's also a therapist, and exploring interactions with various colleagues with a sort of supportive mental health approach to interactions as Eliza reconnects with different people who use Eliza for counseling. And there's an AI supported decision making uh, program within the Eliza game. So cultural icons is an experiment from Google Arts, and which has brought on a number of artists in residence to bring together iconic images of objects with some gameplay in the program. So thinking about the challenges of AI in particular in terms of gameplay, we need to think about the uh, ethics of development of games and how they are used, for instance, by considering first and foremost the real world problems and harms that can be posed by AI and how we mitigate those harms, and thinking about the risks that can be posed by their use, for instance. So, how bias might enter as data, for instance, how bias, racism, misinformation can also then be brought through design, development, and deployment, and how then it's amplified in a wider ecosystem context and also a social world context where communities might be impacted as well as individuals, for instance. So, thinking about the risks that emerge from the use of AI and machine learning technologies, um, loss of autonomy, empathy, personal connection, and how we can mitigate that through more human agency and social interaction when we're thinking about game design, for instance. How we can mitigate risk of poor quality outcomes in learning and education as a result, and having more support through understanding of well-being and integrating more supportive channels through serious gameplay and some of the harsher realities of AI harms and risks of bias and injustice, for instance, and how we can mitigate that through thinking more widely about also social justice, public interest, common good when we are both designing and developing games as well as their implementation.